Thank you. And everyone can hear me okay and see the screen?
Yes.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, this is my talk. I thought it would focus on something related to New Mexico. And this is an article I published a couple of years ago called Active Water Resource Management, Pariah or Blueprint for Western Water Management. Here in Washington State, being on the dry side of the Cascades, we have many of the same water resource issues that you face, but on a much smaller scale. Everyone up here loves to talk about drought. And when I see what they're talking about as a drought, I think, oh, that's adorable that you think that this is a water crisis. We are very fortunate here, but with, of course, anticipated climatic changes, we are going to face very real challenges. They won't be quite the same extent as you have in New Mexico. But this is also an area where New Mexico is really leading the pack. And other than terrible drivers, that's not something we can often say about New Mexico, as much as I love it. And so I thought it's interesting, and I want to give credit to some of the innovative work that's being done there. And I've been trying to encourage people here to look at what Arizona and New Mexico are doing as places with severe and constant issues of water scarcity. Before I begin the talk, I want to give credit to my co-author, who happens to be a New Mexico State University geography graduate. I met her when she moved up here for her master's program in our department. This is Tricia Snyder, and she's now working in the Yakima Basin at the Yakima Basin Fish and Wildlife Recovery Board. But some of you down in New Mexico State or down in Las Cruces will remember her, and I'm sure quite fondly. I also want to acknowledge a couple of people that really helped me when I was in my undergraduate at UNM, Paul Matthews and the late Brad Cullen, who were of tremendous benefit to me. When I arrived in New Mexico, I had failed out of college my first go round, and they were incredibly patient with me, and I would not be here today without their support and encouragement. So I do want to acknowledge them as well. Getting into the topic at hand, I want to mention that water resources is something that we often must, when we deal with water resources, we often have to make tough choices. And it's really easy to just kick the can down the road or to rely on groundwater, which I liken to putting things on a credit card. And you're just basically delaying the inevitable and making the problem compound. And ultimately, and I'm really trying, particularly with COVID, to be more optimistic, but I am seeing signs of us recognizing that it is past time to make some of these tough choices. And I am more optimistic, despite the fact that I can't point towards a whole lot of tangible, definitive signs that we're making great progress. If 2020 wasn't bad enough, I'm now going to make you choose between Kevin Costner and Charlie Sheen. Yeah, that's not good, but those are your choices. Where I'm going with this is that we're never going to agree on water resource management. Water resource management is always going to be contentious. And it's that way because we have conflicting ideologies, just like any other facet of government. We have people that don't want government to exist at all, essentially. And then we have people that believe that the government has a role in being more active. And so we have the idea of what I call the field of dreams: build it and they will come. The infrastructure-based, we can design our way out of this kind of large infrastructure projects ideology. And then we have the Wall Street, just leave it up to the markets and things will take care of themselves ideology. When you look at the source of many of our water problems in the Western US, it dates back from the beginning when we were basically dooming ourselves to failure with dictums such as making the desert bloom, which of course was kind of a crazy idea from the get-go. And the former director of the Bureau of Reclamation, Daniel Beard, in his book from 2016, Deadbeat Dams, in which he critiques many of the dams that he helped build, said that so many of our ideas and Western management strategies were spurred on by ideology more than common sense. And we see examples of that across the Western US. But as I said, I am starting to see, over the last decade, I've seen an awakening of, okay, we need to live within our means here from a hydrologic perspective. And Mullen in 2009 said there, you can read it, communities are beginning to develop strategies for managing resources more effectively as it becomes more difficult to build their way out of the shortages. So most states and municipalities recognize they can't just build their way out of these problems. But that doesn't mean we're not going to still try. And there are a couple of great examples of that here in the Yakima Basin. The Yakima Basin is similar to the Rio Grande in some ways, but there is snowpack that you don't have on the Rio Grande. And so overall, the demands are less than you would see on the Rio Grande. But again, there are challenges just on a smaller scale. But in the early 2000s, there was an attempt to build Black Rock Reservoir, which you can see in the middle of the screen. And you see those red arrows there. Those were pipelines that were going to pump water uphill from both the Columbia and the Yakima to fill a large reservoir on top of a mountain that doesn't ever get snow accumulation. So we're going to pump water uphill at the cost of, it was estimated about $60 million a year to create this absurd reservoir that never should have been built. One of the things that was a real problem with this is the creation of the reservoir was going to raise the water table around Hanford Nuclear Reservation and cause additional radionuclides to infiltrate into the Columbia. And that still wasn't enough to kill this project. They even went so far as to create an environmental impact statement at the expense of $16 million to recognize that this was a terrible idea. So the idea of essentially farming the government and building your way out of it is still alive and well. The locals decided that, well, since they didn't build the Black Rock Reservoir, they recognized that was a terrible idea. They came up with a new project just down the road from Ellensburg, where I am. And again, an off-channel reservoir that was going to require pumping water uphill. So the days of large water projects are not over. There are people still pushing this, build it and they will come, it will make new water. That's a phrase that drives me absolutely bonkers, but that's still one of the main management paradigms in the Western US. We can make new water here. It doesn't work that way, of course. And the great irony being here in the Northwest, we're leading the way in dam removals. And so at the same time, we're spending incredible sums of money to remove dams, but seeing great results. There's talk about building new dams, literally just one watershed over. And it's an interesting juxtaposition of how do we spend our money, removing dams or building new ones. So I argue that we need to ultimately have more market action. In 2000, Joe Della Penna wrote a great article, The Importance of Getting Names Right, in which he said that free markets will never work for water resources. And in that, his argument was essentially markets will never work for water. I disagree with that, but it is true that free markets for water will never work. And we need to recognize that that's a reality. Free markets don't work for many things. As Adam Smith said, we need the invisible hand to have market-based allocations. And Professor Emeritus in economics at UNM, David Brookshire, said markets work. We need rules for the markets, and their efficacy is based on what you design the markets to work well for. You know, is the idea that you want maximum water movement, or is it to protect users? We can design the markets based on the rules that we create. So not a free market, I don't think that matters. The important thing is that we are able to use market-based tools to have a reallocation so that we're not continually going to this idea of we'll just pump more groundwater or we'll make new water through absurdly expensive and environmentally harmful projects. There are two challenges with this. One, how do we protect intergenerational equity? Essentially, we know that our current management paradigms of pumping groundwater are going to come at great cost to future generations. And we can look at any number of issues related to water resource management, and it fails the definition from the Bryant report of sustainable development. Daly in 1973 said that long-range planning is equivalent, is a necessity in the name of moral growth. But we see that this multi-scalar management is kind of a third rail of politics in the United States. And unfortunately, it's future generations that are losing out. And in the case of water resource management, it's almost invariably the environment gets hurt as well as groundwater supplies are going to dwindle. And the other way we need to do this is to protect the environment better. When I was in Albuquerque, I worked, in addition to being a lecturer at UNM, I worked at a consulting firm in town, and I got to do any number of cool projects in the Rio Grande. I took this picture on the 3rd of July in 2008. And I remember that day, it was quite warm, but this was an interesting day. We went out and were looking at these isolated pools in which the Rio Grande silvery minnow was living. And on the way from the car, and this is taken just south of Socorro, from the truck to this point in the river, you of course go by the irrigation canal that is diverting all of the water. And we see that disconnect of environmental protection. Obviously, we need to irrigate crops, but there is a disconnect between the protection of the environment and that. So the former director of the Bureau of Reclamation in his book also said the most fundamental change we need is to thoroughly understand how we can use the water we already have available most effectively. And again, this is living within our own means and not relying on groundwater, not relying on dams that likely are not coming, because we're now looking at those dams more critically from both an environmental and an economic perspective. I'd argue that states have failed, and New Mexico in particular has struggled with these two things: drought planning and clearly defining water rights. And these are the two things that I work with the most. I wanted to include both of these today, but I realized I don't have time. And so I'm going to focus on the clearly defining water rights and how we can work towards improving management by simply knowing what we have. When you think about it, there's no segment of industry that doesn't do inventory once in a while. We need to know what we have available to us. Going back to 2007, the state engineer has known that a full water rights adjudication at the Rio Grande is going to be highly problematic. It's going to be incredibly expensive and quite time consuming. And the estimate was it would cost over $300 million and take over 50 years to complete. When I was at UNM, I was able to take a law class with Chuck Dumars, who would also had clients, including the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District. And he was very proud about the fact he could single-handedly delay through procedural law components any adjudication, and he estimated by 10 or 15 years. So just by doing little things, he could delay that process if his client had a vested interest in doing so. And so obviously stream adjudications are a great thing to have, but are highly problematic. And even if we have a successful adjudication, which we are far from having in so many basins, including the Rio Grande, it's not a one-off. or sorry, let me start by saying this is not a one-off. Other places, it's not just the Rio Grande that has this challenge, but basins across the Western US see this. The Snake River adjudication cost $93 million. To me, it's actually the temporal challenge that's a bigger deal than the economic cost, although we're talking obviously real amounts of money. The Gila River took over 30 years to adjudicate and over $100 million. And the Wind River and Bighorn Basin adjudication took 38 years. Here in the Yakima Basin, which is, there's only 200,000 people that live in the basin. We just finished our adjudication last year. It took 43 years. So even if we're to start all the unadjudicated basins today, we're going to have major drought events, major water scarcity issues before they're complete. Paramount in 2016 estimated that adjudications in New Mexico in 2012 alone included over 70,000 defendants. And since these are protracted legal battles, that number is only going to increase over the next couple decades. So we clearly need another option. And even if we finish that, there are utility concerns with that one-off adjudication. Justice Hobbs in Colorado stated a one-shot adjudication of water rights don't work. I think that's probably overstating it, but what you are left with is a snapshot. Here were the rights on that particular, at that particular point in time. And those rights can change based on non-use, waste, transfers, etc. But we do know that when you don't know who has a right to water, it makes managing water in periods of extreme scarcity more problematic. And so unadjudicated basins are particularly vulnerable in periods of scarcity. There's, that shouldn't come as too much of a surprise, but yet that challenge is going to be pervasive throughout the Western US for extended periods of time if climate models are correct, where we're going to have increased drought frequency, duration, and intensity. So to me, debating the value of adjudications, it is worth a discussion, but we can't get hung up on that. More importantly, we need a solution that can work before the next major drought event. And for this, we need better drought plans, as well as a way to more quickly clarify water rights and have clearer rules. So I see a point in developing drought management tools, and I think it's really important that we develop these during periods where we are not facing extreme water scarcity. What we learned from California in 2015 is they thought that they could just dust off plans from the 90s during the last big drought in 1991 and 1992 and implement that again. Well, things had changed considerably. There were new endangered species listings, and there was not the adequate shovel-ready component associated with their drought management strategies. And essentially everything they had wanted to do was stayed in court, so they couldn't proceed. So we need to have those solutions at the ready, and the time to do that is now when we're not facing extreme drought periods. When things get really intense, there's going to be less cooperation. So we need to ideally deal with these things well in advance of the next period of extreme scarcity. Which leads us to administrative water resource management. And the idea behind this is that the state's technical experts, in the case of New Mexico, the Office of the State Engineer, utilizes its experts instead of judges who have on many occasions admitted that they don't have the technical expertise to make these decisions. And leaving it in the hands of the judiciary means that often judges are going to, in the name of trying to do the right thing, appoint one person, a water master, and you're going to have the decision made by one person who may or may not, they're not vetted by the public or not named by an executive branch person who we elect. And so there's even more of a disconnect from the democratic process than at least going through the state engineer, who, that's, let's face it, the state engineer's office is going to always be in a no-win situation. People are going to complain, but I think overall they do a good job and they've got the technical expertise to manage water as well as anyone. With leaving this in the hands of an executive branch entity like the state engineer, decisions can be made more quickly and there can be more flexible sharing agreements on the fly. And so there are tools that we could not utilize in drought situations if you have to go through the judiciary. So you're relying on the rulemaking process as well, which is beneficial because that's going to happen more quickly and more predictably than if you're relying on the statutory process, because we've seen that, it's difficult to get through things through the statutory process at either the federal or the state level. Now, if I say centralized control, which is what in part this is advocating, most people have a visceral negative reaction to that, where, oh, that doesn't sound good. But really what we're talking about is centralized rules created by that entity with the goal of then enabling water rights holders to market their water if we've got clearer rules associated with it. So it is going to require some change to the system. There's no doubt about that. But ultimately, AWRM is really about centralized rules and not centralized control. And I think that that's one of the misconceptions that has led to a lot of people thinking that this doesn't sound right. That said, administrative water resource management is always going to be controversial because you are empowering an executive branch entity. So the drawbacks, as I mentioned, the executive branch does functionally have a little more power, although you can have safeguards like the state engineer not being necessarily appointed by the governor. And you can consider that perhaps this is further politicizing water resource management, but we already have, water's always going to be a political issue in the Western US. And I don't see this necessarily intensifying. But as I said, this is always going to be controversial because we need to decide, and we're always going to have disagreements amongst ourselves as to the appropriate role of the state on water resource issues. And I think that there's a lot of parallels here with talking about healthcare or any other issue you want to throw out. What is the appropriate role of government? There's about 50 people on this, and I'm guessing we would get about 50 different answers if you're asking, what should the role of government be here? And so less government involvement would be government as just getting out of the way, or government as simply an oversight entity, government as a data collector, which is where we absolutely need more progress. And then during drought periods, should we have government as a water broker? And then the most extreme example is what California did in the 90s, where the government was a market participant buying up any water they could and then reallocating it to the most essential needs, which in an extreme drought might be okay. I don't think most of us want government being an active participant most of the time. But most importantly, we need clear rules in advance of what's going to happen. The precedent for AWRM is actually quite extensive. This is not new, although New Mexico really caused shockwaves in the ratification of its AWRM statutes in the early 2000s. The need for something like this went back to the 1890s in Wyoming. And this is something that Arizona's pursued with its administrative water resource management for its groundwater program starting in the 90s. And this is also something that's been utilized in southeastern Australia in the Murray-Darling Basin. But for a as a comprehensive statute, New Mexico was the first in the Western U.S. to adopt something like this. And in the founding legislation, it was very clear that the lack of adjudications in New Mexico were problematic. Colorado has their adjudications done, but they were done over 100 years ago when there were far fewer attorneys involved, and it was a much simpler process. Anyone who waited past the 1960s has seen it's obviously not an easy path. And I think recognizing the relying on an adjudication is a fool's errand, and the legislation fully recognized the challenge and the pitfalls with that. New Mexico also has inflexible compact obligations that are problematic, but again, that's just the way, that's the reality we have to accept. Endangered species listings, I don't envision that changing anytime soon, or if it does, we're going to have more listings. And climate change, which is going to exacerbate all of the aforementioned problems. So in 2003, the state legislature gave power to the Office of the State Engineer. And right away, the Office of the State Engineer started creating rules and passed those in 2004. And that's been an ongoing process since. And straight away, there were legal challenges to this, as many groups wanted to have this whole process invalidated. And part of that on philosophical grounds, and others for more, we have a vested interest in keeping this at bay for the protection of our water rights. So some of the fundamental questions that immediately began: is the Office of the State Engineer granting water to valid water rights? Because if we don't have an adjudication, how do they make that determination? Is limiting the use of water through an agency a takings, requiring compensation, just compensation under the 5th and 12th Amendments? And does a petitioner claiming a valid water right receive adequate due process here? Has the judicial system been usurped, which would obviously not be something that is acceptable. So how does this work? Well, the state ultimately wants to get to interim priority determinations, but I think that that's a little bit of a misnomer. They're not going to be interim. I think we can assume that at least in our lifetimes, an adjudication's not happening. So these are functionally permanent determinations of water rights. And they are choosing a series of water masters to help make these determinations using the best data we have available. Anyone who's gone down to the Office of the State Engineer and gone through their old hydrographic surveys, those are cool maps. And it's a dream for a historical geographer to go in and look at those, and they're works of art, but they leave a lot to be desired in terms of trying to figure out what happened based on those surveys. And what were they, 1917 and 1922 were a couple of the big ones that were done. Trying to use those to make sense of what exists in 2020 is obviously an issue. And looking at old hydrographic surveys, old air photos, sworn affidavits, which are problematic in terms of their admissibility, etc. And so they're doing their best. It's an exercise in forensics, hydrologic forensics, essentially. But that's no matter what process we use, that's what we have to do. And it's similar to, again, what Arizona's done with its Water Rights Registration Act. And here, what AWRM has done is put the burden of proof on the person making the claim. And that's an important distinction over the adjudication process. And it rewards people being proactive in trying to claim their rights and bring forth the best evidence they have. And the state then creates a database of certificates. Now, the prior appropriation system, people love to malign it. It would have worked great if we had GIS databases when the system was created in the 1800s, but we simply didn't have that. And most of the problems associated with utilizing the prior appropriation system is we simply don't have good records. And this is essentially trying to get that ball rolling today by saying, okay, if you think you have a valid right, bring your proof forward. We've got some evidence too, and then cobbling it together using the best experts. And this functions similar to a Torrens title system, which is something we did for property after the Great Chicago fires. And basically, anytime there's an uncertainty in property boundaries, we utilize something where we have to do our best and make it up as we go along. Actually, kind of a lot of similarities to what we've done in education with COVID. You just do what you can. Well, this do what you can thing was immediately challenged in court, understandably. And there were two big cases in the state of New Mexico in 2007 and 2012. And the challenges were brought by an energy company. And the arguments were on constitutional grounds that this should not be permissible because it's undercutting the judiciary. And one of the main critiques was that the Office of the State Engineer was going to run its own appeals process, which in rulemaking across federal agencies happens all the time. EPA, if it issues a fine, you don't immediately run to court. You have to go through their process and appeal their decision within the EPA before then filing suit. And the other claim was takings, that this was depriving them of property. Well, there had been, between when New Mexico passed AWRM and the first of those decisions, an important case out of the US Supreme Court, Lingle versus Chevron, in which the Supreme Court upheld a state's right to impose restrictions on property if the restrictions do not exceed the previously established standards for takings. So that means it's permissible as long as you're not actually taking something, in which case the person needs to bring forth a inverse condemnation like they would under the Fifth Amendment. But the actual system itself was not invalidated. So then the question is, did they have a legitimate argument based on their claim? And in 2007, the district court said, yes, that this seemed to overstep the state constitution. But in the more important decision in 2012, the New Mexico state, the Supreme Court reversed, saying that the claim of a takings was speculative, that their right had not been negatively impacted. And the other claim, the unconstitutionally vague claim, was thrown out because the state requires in their determination of a valid right under AWRM, the utilization of the best available evidence, which is very similar to best scientific data available standard in the Endangered Species Act. So in the crafting of this act, I think the state did a fantastic job in utilizing some language from other important environmental acts. In the administration of AWRM in recent years, the state recognizes it has limited resources and has created a series of priority basins and is focusing their rules on these. And I think that that's a sensible decision. You can see that the lower Pecos, which will remain a problem because of the Pecos River Compact for the foreseeable future. Lower Rio Grande Basin and San Juan, I think we can agree all of these have frequent periods of water scarcity. So we are recognizing that we have to live within our means in terms of water availability. And the agency also realizes that they have to live within their budgetary confines in managing water. And so they've chosen to focus, and they've got their priority basins. And then they're looking at how do we come up with different scale options for different periods where you've got your routine events or routine drought, I guess is what I would call New Mexico under normal conditions, frankly. Then, desperate times. And then what happens at the worst of times? Do we have a completely different set of rules? And that's ultimately where the state is still trying to figure out its rules. Really 8 years past when it was clear that AWRM would be able to persist. So to conclude, I just want to say that to me, this is and all hands on deck. I think there's no one solution. Everyone keeps wondering, okay, what's going to be the best way forward? I think we have to look at every possibility simultaneously. I ultimately believe there is some infrastructure we need, but we need to figure out how we can move more towards markets, more towards individualized control. But in order to do that, we need the centralized rules that are required via AWRM. And ultimately, I think the other thing, and I know it's a separate topic, but we have to come up with those drought plans, meaningful drought plans. I wrote a paper a few years ago looking at every drought plan in the Western US, and a lot of them weren't worth the paper they were written on. It was just hey, this is a drought plan and we should prepare for drought. And if it happens, let's do something. And we obviously need to get into the nuts and bolts associated with that. But once again, in order to be able to do that, we need to have clearer understandings of our water rights. And so we need to really integrate these two topics. I wanted to leave my talk somewhat short so that I can answer questions.
Yeah, let me suggest, thank you, Mike, for your great topic and for making it so relevant to those of us who are here in New Mexico. Let me suggest that people drop questions into the chat and then I can read them off for Mike to answer. That way you don't have to deal with the chat, Mike. Let's see, we got the first one from Daniel Bean. He said, I find that adjudication in the lower Rio Grande has led to changed water use behavior, specifically overuse of groundwater, to prove up to a given duty of water. What sorts of mechanisms do you think there might be for the government to avoid or take responsibility for this sort of behavior over the course of a 50-year adjudication?
Well, I'm not getting any softballs leading off, huh? That's a great question, and I wish I had a good answer for you. I'm not going to pretend to know that. One of the big challenges we're going to face with groundwater is the fact that the state in New Mexico didn't assert jurisdiction over groundwater until the 60s, I believe it was. And so a lot of those, if any of those wells are predating the 60s, there's nothing the state can do. And along with that, we are seeing that in some basins, the situation is bad enough that cities are willing to, and in some cases, corporations have considered going below 2,000 feet down where the state doesn't have jurisdiction. And so those are going to be ongoing challenges. And I know I'm not answering your question. I recognize the issue and I don't know what's going to happen, frankly. But it's something that we need to look at because again, we'll just drill deeper, which is exactly what we've seen in California and it's still happening today. That's just exacerbating the problem. And unfortunately, a lot of industries saw that the groundwater legislation was going through in California, but it took a couple of years to get through the legislature. And in the meantime, everybody went ahead and put in the last well they think they'll ever need. And that's hugely problematic.
So I'm going to skip around in these questions a little bit. Here's one question from Kathy Cambick. I had a question about the priority basins. Are those in any particular order? The list was all the main basins in the state. So if they're all being addressed, what is the real priority?
That's a good question. They were not listed in any priority. There were a few that weren't missing, but your point is well taken that is a substantial part of the state's main population and main water scarce locations of water scarcity. I think you'd have to ask somebody off the record in the office of the state engineer to get the scoop on how they internally prioritize those, or I guess you could look at their budget and see how they're allocating funds, because I guess that's the truth is in where the dollars are going.
All right, another one specific to the New Mexico context. Which interest group do you think prevailed in the Gila River project getting its latest setback?
I can't answer that. I've actually not followed it. Yeah, it's best for me not to weigh in. I don't want to say anything.
All right, so here's one that I think is more about your region. Asking, seeing as they're willing to invest so much into large scale projects such as dams, why is there no investment into reclamation plants and desalination plants? Does this have to do with legalities?
I don't think it has to do with legalities so much as the cost associated with it and getting, I think that we're starting to see a real shift. Let me take a step back. We're starting to see a real shift, and I think the Amit adjudication up in northern New Mexico was one of the key turning points, where in the first round, or not the first round, but one of the rounds of negotiations, that case started in 1966, I believe, and in around 2000, they reached an agreement in principle amongst the parties, but they said, we'll get the federal government to kick in, I think it was about $400 million in aiding the adjudication for various projects within that tiny little area near Tesuque. And the federal government said no. And that really surprised them because historically, if you threw a water project in front of Western senators and members of Congress, they would always approve it because there was that, we'll approve yours if you approve ours, and this is the best path forward to solve water problems is we'll just write a check and be done with it. And since we're no longer seeing that, I think that there's a resistance to funding desal plants because I think just about every major city in the Western US could use a desal plant. And I'm thinking the federal government doesn't want to create a precedent of funding one for fear of having to fund many others. There's also the issue of, in the case of New Mexico, if you have to go down 2,000 feet for desal plant, it becomes incredibly expensive. I worked on the environmental impact statement for the Alamogordo desal plant for a little bit, and that was a fascinating project, but the costs per acre foot are outrageous.
All right. Here's one asking if you could talk about indigenous water rights, especially within the legal concepts of first come, first serve, and use it or lose it.
Okay. In terms of indigenous rights, that's another area where we've had this abysmal failure, and adjudications need to clarify their rights first and foremost. And we know that they are, for the most part, senior, but there are a few oddities when you're dealing with federal reserved rights. Here in the Yakima Basin, they don't have the most senior rights because their water right was based on the date that they signed their treaty, which is fundamentally abhorrent to me, but that's the way that the law has been interpreted. Part of this, we need to have a change to federal law, which allows adjudications of tribal rights to be done in state court, where the state has a vested interest in minimizing the quantity of water that goes to indigenous groups. And so I think we need an end to the McCarran Amendment that's actually been written by any number of scholars. The McCarran Amendment giving states that power was granted in 1954, and it's just not worked. I understand the idea behind giving states that, since tribal rights need to be integrated within the state system in terms of allocating water, but it is giving the states who have a vested interest the power to adjudicate something that they should not be adjudicating. So it's an ongoing problem. It's going to require the federal government rolling back the McCarran Amendment. I don't see that happening anytime soon. It also requires that states, if they are going to be doing these adjudications, do it in good faith. Here in the Yakima Basin, we just finalized our adjudication. Again, it started in 1976. It finished last year. And the tribe got, I think, about a third of the water it should really have received if you utilize the practically irrigable standard that's been well established in case law. And so while the adjudication is done, I guess I should use air quotes there, eventually the Yakima Nation, the Confederated Tribes of the Yakima Nation, are going to be able to take the state to court and get a larger percentage of that water that's been adjudicated. And so the junior rights are probably not as secure as people think. And it's fundamentally because they are senior, or, you know, they should be the most senior, but if they're close to senior, we have to figure those out first. There's no point in continuing this facade of, oh, we'll just figure those out later. If they're the first entity to receive diverted water, well, then we need to figure that out straight off the top.
Referring back to the earlier question about the Gila diversion, I'm just going to refer people to the chat where a couple people have posted some information about that in terms of the work to defeat that. Let's see, let's go to Bob Sabi's question. It seems that there are so many interactions and feedbacks between the many variables in water management. What are the tools you think we need to solve? What are the tools you think we need to solve issues in water management that take into account the potential impacts from policy decisions?
Great question. Very complex answer. I feel like in my talk, it actually went a little faster. I was worried about time, and so I cut out a lot of things that I wanted to talk about. One of them was more extensive discussion of tribal rights. So I appreciate that last question to address that, as well as endangered species concerns. And I have friends in Albuquerque working on Rio Grande Silvery model, minnow habitat models. And I think the future is going to rely on really extensive GIS databases mixed with hydraulic modeling, PHAB sim models for habitat, as well as economic models. And I think the potential for using agent-based models to figure this out and to model human behavior, as scary as that is, particularly, I just watched The Social Dilemma a couple days ago, and it makes you recognize how terrifying some of that AI work can be in terms of manipulating us. And again, I feel awkward saying that, but I think that the power of those models is here. We've got the computer capability and the programming capabilities now. When I was a grad student at UNM, I was part of an NSF project looking at early modeling, the integration of these kinds of models, and it wasn't ready. It was in '99 and 2000, and you could prove the concept, but you couldn't do anything with any managerial utility at the time. But obviously 20 years of computing power for, moving forward 20 years in that, and then you add in the ability of AI models, I think you could do some really cool stuff. I think it would probably take 10 years and millions of dollars. And then you've got that age-old issue of, well, how would you rather spend that $10 million? Clarifying the water rights or running the model that would tell you how to better utilize water resources if you had clear property rights?
All right,
obviously the answer is we need more funding in general, because we know water resource issues are not going away. Let's suck it up and fund this stuff up front, as opposed to, just trying to fund it at a bare minimum level continuously.
All right, here's a question from Arthur Guerrero. And if he needs to explain this acronym, Arthur, you can jump on. Are there any major impacts involved with YTC in your area in regards to projects and relationship at all levels?
Yeah, can you clarify? I don't want to misspeak.
Arthur, you want to clarify YTC?
The Yakima Training Center, that's right there in the area.
Yes. My question, relationship with water or surrounding communities?
Overall, in general, yes to all that, because we know federal, state agencies are always overbearing per se, especially when it comes to water rights, and communities always have problems with what they decide, as you were mentioning earlier.
Yeah. Let me take a step back. For those that aren't familiar with Central Washington, we have two very large federal facilities that are close to one another. The Hanford Nuclear Reservation, right along the Columbia, which was picked as part of the Manhattan Project, very similar to Los Alamos because it was the middle of nowhere at the time. And the Yakima Training Center, which is a place kind of similar to White Sands, again, in a very remote area, at least it was at the time, where there's any number of military trainings and explosions. Occasionally you will hear a big sonic boom and think, oh yeah, that was 15 miles away, but you can hear it and it'll rattle your windows. So in terms of, there are any number of challenges with a facility like that in terms of being a good neighbor. In terms of water resources, they haven't claimed a ton of water, and it's just far enough away from the Yakima itself that there's not been there's not a lot of discussion of consternation on a waterfront. But in terms of being good neighbors and habitat for various species, there are people that aren't happy with it, but I've not heard of many. People will bring lawsuits occasionally, but you know, it's tough to beat the Department of Defense on that sort of thing.
We're getting close to the end of our time here, but I think we might be able to squeeze in the last few here. So Chris Duval asks or says, it seems like there's a disconnect between the rates of climate change and population growth and the rate at which legal and policy changes happen within governmental institutions. As an example, 43 years for an adjudication. Do you see any ways to speed up institutional actions?
I think that that's what AWRM is all about, is we have to make these decisions and need to make them more quickly. And people can always challenge them if they have legal standing, so they can't bring frivolous lawsuits. But if they find that the AWRM decision is truly off, they can still take it to court. But the idea is that we have to be able to make these decisions over a course of 5 to 10 years, as opposed to waiting on 43-year adjudication. Or in the case of the Rio Grande, I'm not even sure it could be done in 50. And so that's the idea, is we've got to find these smaller things. And if the rules are known, even if they're suboptimal, we can adapt better than the waiting to see what the rules will be 10 or 15 years from now.
All right, from Rebecca Hobart, what roles do or could large government agencies have in facilitating state drought plans and providing funding? And what's the role of Congress?
The role of Congress is always going to be what Congress decides it is. Occasionally, out of nowhere, you'll get some new grand proclamation about water management. A lot was made a few years ago about providing some funding, and the idea that they're going to improve coordination amongst between federal agencies and state agencies. I've yet to see any of those actually improve that communication. I think in terms of funding, the Bureau of Reclamation is always going to be front and center, along with Fish and Wildlife Service, in terms of managing endangered species. And so those two are going to have the disproportionate say. We've seen great success in stabilizing populations of the silvery minnow in the state because of funding that was provided around 2000. And having a senior senator is always going to be key for getting that funding to your state. And we saw that was Pete Domenici. Regardless of where you sit on the political aisle, he was good at getting funds to New Mexico.
All right, it is 4 o'clock here in the Mountain Time Zone, so I think we better wrap it up. I want to say thanks, Mike, for being with us. Thanks for this great presentation. It's great to see you virtually in New Mexico again. Hopefully we'll see you for real in New Mexico. And to everyone else, this is the last of our colloquium series for 2020. So congrats, you made it to the end. We'll see you again in 2021. And I'm just going to wish everybody a happy Thanksgiving. Stay safe. Don't get COVID. And we'll see you next year.
Thank you all for hosting me.
Thanks, Mike.
I appreciate